Joining us now is Harsh V. Pant, a distinguished fellow and head of the Observer Researchers Foundation Strategic Studies Program. Harsh, thank you so much for being with us here on the broadcast. How do you view this particular retaliation from Iran? They themselves are saying this was the weakest response that they had up their sleeve.
Yes, I think it was very quick, and it was in some ways predictable, given that Iraq is the theater in which US and Iran are now competing with each other. But perhaps, and as they've accepted, this was perhaps easiest to do. The question is whether it can de-escalate from now onwards, or whether America would be under, or the Trump administration in particular, would be under greater pressure now to respond to this, or whether there would be enough incentives on both sides now to de-escalate and to use this as an opportunity that something has been done by Iran, and now perhaps things can go back to some sense of sense of normalcy. This action-reaction cycle, I think, will continue for a while.
Right, and how do you view the response from U.S. President Donald Trump? He's saying so far so good. He's completely shrugging off this particular retaliatory strike.
See, it's very ironical, because in the first instance, the attack or the killing of Soleimani was supposed to enhance American deterrence in the region. Now, if Iranian reaction to it actually proves the opposite, then America is in a bind. So clearly, Mr. Trump and his team will be under pressure to make a case that this is not a big deal, because if this does become a big deal, then they are in for trouble, because then they have to respond in some way, if only to enhance or to underscore the role of American deterrence posture in the region. So clearly, for Trump administration, for Mr. Trump himself, who goes into a very tough electoral cycle, these are the questions that perhaps should have been thought of before Mr. Soleimani's killing was undertaken, because clearly there are broader issues of grand strategy here, which perhaps were not thought of before the initial action was taken.
Harsh, we are in a very precarious situation as far as the whole world is concerned because of these tensions. And at this point in time, we've seen a response from Iran. We've also seen a cyber attack that took place before. So in that sense, do you think that Iran is sort of planning a composite strategy on how to respond to this? Because the outpouring of grief and the public hysteria in Iran is huge, unprecedented.
See, yes, I think what has happened is now Iran seems to be at least completely united behind the hardline faction that wants, or that would want, a very, very strong reaction to what has happened and the targeting of Soleimani. So clearly there will be pressure now to respond in various ways. Now, Iran cannot frontally take on the US. Its economy is in shambles. Its military is not that great to have a one-on-one conflict with the US. So therefore, it will resort to all sorts of hybrid warfare, which perhaps Iran is a great expert of. And so there are a number of proxies, there are a number of pressure points that Iran can use in the region. And it has already indicated, it is indicating now after this attack on the Iraqi bases, that it would go after Israel, and it might even go after Dubai in UAE, where American forces are. That there are multiple pressure points as far as America is concerned, which Iran can use. And Iran has proxies all over the Middle East, which have been on the ascendant for the last few years. So Iran has multiple ways in which it can respond, and perhaps, as you call it, a comprehensive response or composite response is what Iranians would be looking at. But they have fired the first salvo, and we have to wait and see what the response of the Americans might be to this, because on that would depend counter moves by Iranians.
Right, Harsh, as we speak, we have breaking news updates coming in on this big top focus here. So we understand from Iraqi military sources that there have been no Iraqi casualties after 22 missile strikes on bases housing U.S. troops. That's what we understand, Harsh, at this point in time. There have been no Iraqi casualties in the Iranian strike on the joint U.S. Military bases. So clearly, Iran and Iraq too, uniting in this moment of crisis.
Yes, who would have thought when Saddam Hussein was removed from power, that there would be a time when Iran and Iraq would seemingly join forces with against the US. And they were arch rivals at one point in time. And suddenly now, because of these peculiar circumstances, we have a situation where Iran and Iraq seem to be working in unison. Now, clearly, Iran also will be under pressure to not do anything that would put Iraqis in jeopardy, because they would like to maintain the goodwill that they have generated after America's reaction. And so I think if at all Iranians were planning this attack, they would have been much smarter in making sure that Iraqis are not targeted, because that would undermine their own response or their own credibility in Iraq, which has grown tremendously after a setback that they were receiving just a few weeks back, where Iraqis were demonstrating against Iran. So there has been a shift in the Iraqi perception, and Iraqis are now demanding that both Iran, at one point they were demanding Iran and US both leave Iraq. But today the sentiment against America is much higher, and Iranian-based militias have always been a very, very important source of strength for Iran in Iraq, and they would continue to do so. So my sense is that Iraq is very fractured along ethnic lines, and those fractures will have a great bearing on how the future of Iraq unfolds, even if the crisis that we are looking at between US and Iran does not escalate any further.
Harsh, we're also discussing this at a point in time when there's a threat for U.S. allies in the region. We're talking of threats about an attack on Israel. How much do you think that is a possibility at this stage?
I think this is a serious issue for America to ponder upon, because initially, and if you look at what had been happening in the Middle East, there was a perception growing in the Middle East that America is going back on the Carter Doctrine. Carter Doctrine, which believed that America would remain the preeminent power in the region and protect its adversaries as well as its interests. Now, there is a perception that there has been a growing perception in the region that Trump administration is actually giving up that Carter Doctrine in favor of a more inward-looking posture. And many, for example, were expecting a stronger American response to the attack on Saudi facilities, for example, but that did not happen. And one by one, the Iranian proxies have won in the region. Iranian-backed groups have won in various conflict zones, be it Lebanon, be it Yemen, be it Syria. And therefore, the perception has been growing that Americans are not really interested in the Middle East now that they don't have that kind of dependence on Middle Eastern oil and gas. So clearly, there is the American allies were feeling jittery. One of the reasons why attack on Soleimani happened was that America wanted to reassure its allies that they are in there for a long haul, that they would take on Iran if Iran becomes too strong, and they would take on Iran frontally by targeting Iranian assets like Soleimani and Quds forces. So therefore now, if Iran decides to target American allies would hope that America has contingency plans in place which can protect those allies. Now, Israel, of course, is a formidable ally. It won't be easy for Iran to target Israel that easily. But there are other allies also at stake, and Iran has declared its intent to target not only Israel but also UAE. So there are issues. I think the larger Shia-Sunni rivalry in the region, the larger Israel versus the Arab rivalry in the region, that can flare up any moment, and one wonders whether all these things were thought through when the initial targeting of Soleimani happened.
Harsh Pant joining us on this broadcast with that perspective on the big story that we're tracking. Thank you, Harsh, for joining us on the broadcast here on WION World is One.